This is a story about an exceptional, award-winning, and well-respected professor, Dr. Michael J. Shively, and how the very university he had dedicated his career to, Utah Valley University, waged a protracted and prolonged investigation against him based on false allegations without due process and resulting in his tragic suicide. Dr. Shively was a tenured professor who had taught anatomy and physiology at UVU for 27 years. He had served as a president of the Utah Valley University's Faculty Senate and chair of the Department of Life Sciences. Dr. Shively's life was suddenly and irreversibly derailed on March 25, 2019, due to the gross negligence on the part of UVU and the intentional conspiracy and false accusations by a fellow associate professor, Sarah J. Flood. UVU's own detailed investigative report after 25 interviews provides extensive evidence and admissions that discredited the false claims of any serious offense affecting the public interest. Over 20 UVU professors have criticized UVU's handling of the Shively matter and openly expressed concern for how UVU handled this even before Dr. Shively's death. They saw the shape of something that seemed wrong, a protracted investigation of a tenured professor without due process. They questioned why suspension was warranted and why Dr. Shively's classroom practices were under scrutiny. Unlike typical cases fighting government immunity where the relationship between victim and perpetrator has not been established, Dr. Shively had been revered by students, faculty, alumni, and administrators for 27 years, making it even more tragic that the very institution to which Dr. Shively had dedicated his life was responsible for ending it as well. In this insider exclusive investigative special, we go behind the headlines. Injustice in America, Dr. Michael J. Shively's story, to meet with Steve Sumption, Dr. Shively's family, and colleagues to get the truth. As we take you inside today's legal system, examining Steve's strategies and his clients' thoughts, and show you the relief and vindication for shattered lives and holding those responsible for justice. The compassion, warmth, love, and determination of the human spirit found within this story is neither imagined nor contrived. It is truly a personal crusade and a telling journey of what it means to seek justice in an American courtroom. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Utah. It is my great pleasure to introduce Steve Sumption to the show and Dr. Ann Shively. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Steve, you are representing the Shively family in this matter. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the case and what's involved?
Dr. Shively was perhaps the most awarded professor at UVU who received no notice and was suspended for 5 months. He came to me seeking help in addressing the claims that he was claimed to have had a serious offense affecting the public interest. And he showed me the letter signed by the president of the university and asked me, how can this be? And we looked at his history of having no notice of this until suddenly being suspended. And the university went through 28 investigations, interviews with people involved. After 25 interviews with various students and faculty members, the university acknowledged in the report that there was unsubstantiated claims against Dr. Shively, unfounded claims, And instead of winding up the investigation, they chose to expand the investigation and prolong it an additional 2 months by bringing in a consultant to evaluate Dr. Shively's tests and his textbook. And so they hired someone who was actually adverse in the sense of they claimed it was an independent analysis by a consultant, when in fact it was someone that Dr. Shively had previously written extensively about the improper scientific backing for this particular consultant's work. And they hired that same individual to critique Dr. Shively in order to justify expanding and extending the investigation against Dr. Shively.
So you can say that they were not the best of friends, correct?
Correct.
Okay. What happened then?
Well, the problem is that during this time frame, Dr. Shively and his excellence in teaching that was unquestionable in how effective he was with the vast majority of students, his state of mind became very concerning to the family. And we, even in the report itself, it acknowledges from the supervising professor, department chair, that he was worried about his condition. That got put in the investigation report that UVU prepared. And so they were aware of the effect, all this weight loss and all of this, not just weight loss, but sleeplessness was causing, to the extent that in their own report they learned of the severity this was having on Dr. Shively.
Now, Ann, you were at home with your husband.
Well, when he got the letter, he came home immediately. The letter was a surprise. He was asked to relinquish his keys and was marched to the car by security, which was extremely humiliating. It's about a 30-minute drive from the office to home, and when he came in, the first thing he said to me was, "Annie, it's bad, it's really bad." And China just leaned on me, and we went to the living room and sat down, and he told me about the letter of suspension. There was no, the accusations were not clear, and he'd had no opportunity to respond. So he was so convinced that he had done nothing wrong, that he had energy and willingness to fight the case. But as day by day, with no feedback from the university, and he was isolated. Employees, including his department chair and colleagues, were told that they could not speak to him or have any communication with him at the risk of losing their jobs.
Let me ask you, do you know if there was an email put out or if there was some correspondence put out saying you cannot talk to Dr. Shively while this investigation is going on?
Well, two things. First, I was told by his department chair, who said, "I'm violating this because it's just not right. I need to talk to Mike." And then his other colleague, who was his lab manager, said to me that he had been required to sign a document. I did not see that document, but his lab manager, Don Holman, said he had to sign a document saying that he could not speak to Dr. Shively unless or without the risk of losing his job.
Yeah, let me ask you something, Steve. Is that legal?
The problem with that is if there's a serious offense affecting the public interest. I mean, if this is life-threatening, then I think this university could make a claim that we can't allow for communication for a limited period of time to get to the facts. So there is a basis for allowing for the truth to come out. The problem is after they learn that the claims are unsubstantiating, to continue the gag order, that's what's improper.
As this investigation went on, and on and on. What did you see your husband doing then? How was he acting then?
Very anxious, and that increased day by day. And then he began to slip into deep despair,
And what would he do?
isolating himself, not able to eat, not able to sleep, was convinced that he had some kind of physical illness, mental illness, or physical illness. And then he became delusional. He began to have questions about reality. He lost touch with the reality.
Now, you are a therapist,
Yes.
PhD in psychology. Obviously, you know more how to handle a situation like this than most people. Were sometimes family members are the worst people to bring in and help because nobody pays attention to them. But did you get or did you bring in outside help to come to the house and talk to him or what?
Well, we took him, my daughter and I, my oldest daughter and I, took him to a therapist. He didn't really want to go, which is not unusual. But he was diagnosed and also delirious. But I need to explain that with delirium, it goes in and out. It can come on suddenly, and then they may be delirious. Well, how do I know he's delirious? Well, an agitation, inability to rest or to sleep, to eat. He lost between 25 and 30 pounds.
When he's losing this weight, he's not eating, right?
No.
Are you home during this
Yes.
time? The entire time?
Yes.
It must be very frustrating seeing your partner of many years, your husband, go through this.
It was heart-wrenching because he just became a shell of himself. Mike was a very vibrant, healthy man. He was an athlete. He had just gotten, he had just gotten back from training for a marathon canoe race, 267 miles in the Texas heat, that he'd raced almost every year and won many of those races.
Yeah.
So he was in superb physical health.
And I want to address that because usually, like a marathon runner or you're talking about 260 miles, you have to be very disciplined. You have to be focused. You have to have a mentality of steel. Why couldn't he apply that to his own personal life?
He continued to work out for a few weeks. And then he got to the point where because of his loss of weight and inability to sleep, he just withdrew. He would talk to the children and to me, and we live in a very close neighborhood. So he would interact with his neighbors, but everyone noticed the loss of weight, the haggard look, the sparkle in his eyes were gone. And he became very dependent on me.
In what way?
Just wanting physical contact. If we were sitting, he'd want to touch me, or as though I would ground him. And this deterioration just continued with the loss of weight. And then, as I said, he became delusional. He believed that he was being terminated.
A person can't separate their personal perspective of themselves from their professional perspective of themselves. And your husband was at that university for 27 years, well regarded, very accredited, had lots of awards.
Over 15.
Did you ever say to him, even if the worst situation happens and they terminate you, that doesn't reflect on who you are?
Of course.
Okay, but he wasn't listening.
No.
Okay.
I think Mike's core identity was to be a good man. And that meant being a good husband, good father, good grandfather, great fun grandfather. Incidentally, our first great grandchild was born on the day he died. Never got to meet him. But he was convinced that physically he was dying. Physically, he was dying, that the food was not going through his body.
What happened on that final day?
It was in the evening of the final day, and he suddenly got up and made a phone call to a colleague who was being very supportive of Mike and encouraging him. And all of a sudden, he took the phone away from his ear and turned to me with our son standing nearby and said, "I've been terminated. There is a letter in the mailbox telling me I've been terminated," which was not true at all. But that's what Mike heard, and that's what he believed. He asked me to go upstairs, and we went upstairs, and he was inconsolable. A few hours later is when he took his life.
Where did he do that? In the backyard?
He did it in the workshop. We had removed, because we were concerned about his deteriorating mental health and the onset of the mental illness, we were concerned, so we removed all guns, all pills. We took all the precautions one would take to prevent suicide.
Okay.
Both the kids and I did that.
Right now, Steve is responsible for suing the university because, he holds them responsible. You're on national TV right now. Tell our audience, who do you hold responsible for this and why?
There is no doubt in my mind that UVU caused his death. The clinching factor in that was his last words were, "I've been terminated." And then he went into a kind of an agitated delirium, pacing, walking upstairs. I tried to console him, and finally, just out of fatigue, he went to sleep, or so I thought, and I laid down by him. And I woke up later in the wee early morning hours, and he was not in bed. So I alerted my son, and we began he called our daughter, and she said, "Find him immediately." And we found him in his workshop. We'd never thought of a nail gun, but he used a nail gun and shot himself.
I'm very sorry about that. I'm sorry it came to this. Steve, where are we in this case right now? It's still pending, isn't it?
This case is on appeal to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And we're in the briefing process of dealing with the dismissal of the case from Utah District Court.
Okay, well, we certainly hope this national network TV show will get the university to own up to their responsibilities, right?
Yes.
Again, you have my sincere condolences. And we hope that this show is seen and shares enlightenment to the people who are responsible. Okay, I want to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
We have with us today two of Dr. Shively's colleagues, Dr. Sam Rushforth and Dr. James Harris with us, so let's bring them on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sam Rushforth and Dr. James Harris. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Both of you were colleagues and friends of Dr. Shively, correct?
That's right.
Tell our audience what you remember best about Mike.
Mike was a friend. He was a very, very intense guy. And when I came to UVU, I felt it was my responsibility to improve not only the university, but the biology department and so forth, the other departments. And it was clear to me from the start that Mike was a solid, in fact, an excellent academic. And he and I, we had many conversations together about where the institution should go. Many times we didn't agree, many times we did agree. But he was passionate and intense about his love for the university and about his concern for his students.
I've known Mike as long as he has been here at UVU.
That was what, 27 years?
27 years, yeah. And we've been involved in classes together. These are outdoor experiential classes and things. And I've taken personal trips with him. So I've known Mike in many different capacities for a number of years. Fine academic, a good friend.
Okay, so as it was with Mike, it probably was a big shock when you learned that he had been suspended.
It was quite a horrifying shock, actually. Mike phoned me and said, you're the only person I can talk to because you're retired, and I've been banned from talking to anybody at the university. I've been ushered off campus and told that I couldn't talk. And I was not only shocked, I remember saying, Mike, I'm so damn sorry. If I had been the dean and the security had walked you into my office, I'd have thrown their asses right out the door and got the president on the phone and told her she was basically full of shit. Because that's not the way academics get treated, in particular, one of your better academics.
Right. We know the facts of the case. We know what happened to Mike from Ann speaking on a day-by-day basis. What do you think, what's the real story behind this whole false accusation? What is your opinion of that?
I have a couple of different ideas about it. One of them, I was able to read the investigative report in the last few days, and I was a little bit shocked by the aggressiveness of one of the student accusers, who was the ringleader and happened to be a nephew of the president of the institution. And I don't think anyone else would have gotten that much attention.
And what was his, it was him, right? It was a he, right?
It was a he.
What were his claims, his allegations?
Well, that's the remarkable thing. He wasn't even one of Mike's students. He was in a different class, but was the ringleader in getting students to complain and organizing this whole thing. Very aggressive individual.
Yeah, well, that's, again, my question is, what do you think's behind this whole thing? I mean, why is he doing this?
Oh, he thought it was too hard. I'm sure that was it.
Class.
Yeah, the class.
So get rid of the teacher because the class is too hard.
Oh, this is a common thing. Yeah.
It is.
Seriously, huh? What do you think about the president of UVU, who really has to be objective, but apparently was not?
I don't know Dr. Tuminez, but when she came, I was somewhat concerned because she has had no academic leadership experience. She came from industry, in fact, from Microsoft. So when I heard that she had marched Mike off campus, I thought, well, my worries have come true. She doesn't know how we work in academia, and you don't march people off campus unless there's something horrifically wrong. You check it out immediately, and you take care of it, and you do it in a manner that is befitting the professional you're dealing with.
Were you retired at the time?
I was retired at the time.
Did any of you make a phone call to the president or the office and say, hey, what are you doing?
No, I did not.
And I was not retired, and as a result, Mike was not able to speak with me. I did attempt to call him once at home, didn't get an answer, and subsequently I learned that he wasn't allowed to talk with his colleagues anyway, so I didn't ever make another attempt to reach out to him. I did, however, send an email message to President Dominguez and was very direct and expressed my concerns about this whole thing. Now, this is after the fact. This is after Mike's death.
Did she respond to you?
No, she did not.
So who speaks for her?
Good question. I didn't get a response to that particular email. So,
Sarah Flood, how does she figure in this?
I don't know Sarah Flood. She was an anatomist that was hired by the institution to work with Mike.
Assistant professor, correct?
Assistant professor, her first real job in academia. And I don't know if she was intimidated by Dr. Shively, by Mike. I just don't really know. But the Mike that I have seen for a long time, as I say, he can speak very intensely. He would argue strongly for his points of view, but the critical factor is he would argue. He wouldn't dictate, nor would he shout down, nor would he denigrate. But you should be willing to have an argument with him because he'll come prepared. He would come prepared to defend his positions.
Right. You're on national TV, both of you right now. What do you want the world to know about what happened to Dr. Michael Shively?
Well, Dr. Shively was treated horrifically. He was not treated professionally. He was not treated as he should have been according to his status and long and sterling career. He was treated like in a non-humane way. He had no idea this investigation was going on. He simply got marched off campus, told not to come back, asked for his keys, told not to talk to anybody at the institution. Wham, bam, see you later. It was truly a debacle on the part of the university.
What about yourself, Jim?
After reading the investigative report, which is a laughable report, there's no substance to it at all. The one thing that got him taken off campus was a supposed threat to faculty. An early interview, early May, that was proven to be false. And at that point, he should have been brought back onto campus.
I read that was made by Sarah Flood.
Yes.
I read later on that she said that she misunderstood what he had said or something like that.
And at that second, he should have been allowed back on campus, and he wasn't.
Well, this is a very unfortunate.
Well, what we're seeing was a healthy, productive individual that over the course of 5 months was emotionally, professionally, and physically, in the end, destroyed.
That is very unfortunate. I want to thank you for speaking out.
Sure.
You don't have to do this, but you got to do what's right, and that's.
We have to do what's right, especially for a friend and colleague.
Didn't deserve to go out the way he did.
Not at all.
It is ironic that the university that he dedicated his life to for 27 years is the same university that basically killed him. I want to thank both of you for being on the show and speaking out. People need to speak out.
Thank you.
I understand we have today two of Mike's daughters here today, Dorianne and Lori, so let's bring them on. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dorianne Pye and Lori Pye to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell our audience a little bit about what your dad meant to you, Lori.
Well, thank you for the question. Mike and I shared a great deal in our academic career. He was my most avid reader for the textbook I'm working on, and so much inspired by him and my mother. But also, you know, he was not only my best critic, he was a solid friend in the sense that we were adults, and when Mom and Mike married, and Mike embraced us as if we were his very own. And I never really thought about him as any other thing than my dad, whether he was not my biological father or not. And we hiked together, we kayaked, we were canoe partners, we set state records as mixed pairs partners. We had a outdoor physical relationship together, both of us appreciating and loving the outdoors. And we also had that academic relationship, with my career being in the academics and his as well. And so we shared the trials and tribulations of teaching and what it means to be a scholar and what it means to be a professor. We had a lot of conversations around that. So I think we provided a lot of support for each other in those areas. But Mike was always someone you could go to, and I knew that I could always trust him for a steady answer no matter what I needed around scholarship or academics or writing or teaching, and it's been a dismemberment to lose him.
What about yourself, Dory?
So much of those same things I think I shared with Mike. We had a very deep personal connection through our religious philosophy and our religious beliefs. I think towards the end of Mike's life, we definitely had a much closer relationship as he relied heavily on me to help try to make sense of what was happening to him from a psychological perspective, which was difficult because we're talking about going through an experience which is not just debilitating psychologically and physically, but it is dehumanizing. And for Mike, having to confront and be confronted by the possibility that everything he thought about himself and believed about himself to be true over the last 60 some odd years of his life was being called into question.
Right. You are a therapist. That's your profession. Obviously, if I was in your shoes, and I had a similar situation with my dad, the thing that I would continually stress is, whatever happens here at UVU is not a reflection on who you are. I'm sure you had that conversation with him, right?
Many times.
And what would be his response?
Unfortunately, he couldn't hear that. He was listening, but he couldn't hear it. And he couldn't separate what he had come to believe as a huge part of his identity was being a professor, was working with students, was developing and writing textbooks and lab guides and teaching labs and teaching lecture sections. That became an integral part of who he was.
Let me ask you this question. UVU is only one place of employment. I'm sure you had a discussion with them, say, hey, whatever happens here, you're a valued person in your business, in your profession. I'm sure we can get something else for you later on. Did that fall on deaf ears too?
Yeah, he was such an integral part of the UVU community. And he was planning to retire from UVU at some point in the future, a while in the future. He was not ready for that at this point. And so to have his community taken away from him, to be isolated from that, to have his colleagues not be allowed to interact with him or talk with him, to not be allowed to have representation at each of these 8 interviews they conducted over a 2-month period, and an investigation that lasted 5 months, when really we were expecting 45 days, and it was extended into 5 months, became an excruciating experience for him.
Did you ever receive, both of you, any phone calls out of the blue, from him saying, I need help or anything like that?
Yeah, we talked very frequently on the phone, and towards the end, when we were trying to get him more help than we were able to give, he was waitlisted for therapy. We were trying to get him into University Neuropsychiatric Institute. There were no beds available. We had a plan in place to be able to do that when he took his life.
Okay, let's talk about UVU now. And let's talk about this lawsuit from your perspective, okay? Who do you hold responsible, Lori, for your father's passing?
I hold Astrid Timenis ultimately responsible, the president of UVU, Utah Valley University. And I say that because a university community really needs to be able to be accountable for its practices, its policies, and its procedures. And ultimately, it's up to the university president to uphold those, to implement those. But at its most basic core are policies and practices of justice and respect and fairness. And you would think in any situation, no matter what that situation is, that the president would have enough oversight to be sure that those kinds of practices and policies were being implemented, especially under an investigation. Especially under investigation of a 27-year tenured professor of the caliber of Mike. And so when we look at the violation of duties, which was, I feel like, a catastrophic failure in her duty as president, and moral psychology to not uphold fairness in the investigation, to allow her nephew to come to her with claims that were unsubstantiated, that were false, that were left unexamined, to support an investigation that had already been put in jeopardy by Karen Clems. So the responsibility is really up to the president to make sure that those policies are not violated.
And was there any interaction between them ever prior to this time?
So that's an interesting question, because on April the 6th, Mike wrote a letter to Astrid Timenis. And in that letter, he described his ordeal of his keys being taken and being marched out of his office as mentally traumatic and emotionally wrenching. So she knew from the beginning that this was a very difficult scenario for someone who had received numerous awards, who had never had any kind of claims levied against him in any way, anywhere, at any time. And to be treated in such an ignominious fashion. So she was aware of that. He asked Spencer Phillips, the principal investigator, and Kat Brown, an associate vice president, to deliver the letter to her. He never heard from her. This is a 27-year tenured faculty member of hers.
You're on national TV, both of you. Do you have any final words you want to put out there about how people should be treated and how the staffs and the management at universities should handle situations like this?
Well, I think, the big question is, this man died by suicide. So how can we be held accountable? Well, what's interesting to note, if you look at UVU's investigation, is the way that Karen Clems, who was general counsel for UVU at the time, conducted investigations, and historically how UVU had done it, as Karen Clems had said before she got there, she didn't bother to look at how those investigation tactics affected the people that she was investigating. She just followed on from a previous administration. And the problem is that the tactics that she used, isolationism, disenfranchisement, ostracization from your community, produced what we know in my field as 4 pillars of suicide: isolation, an inability to cope with a prolonged traumatic event, hopelessness, and this feeling of self-loathing and self-hate. And in Mike's interview with the psychiatrist that we took him to, he talked to her about having these feelings of self-loathing and self-hatred. So UVU's investigation actually emphasized the 4 pillars of suicide that we know today will probably bring about that result in someone. And I think you have some thoughts to say about people who may be looking at UVU.
Right. Well, that's very well said, Dory. The most egregious, I think, violation on President Tuminis's part is her indifference to knowing that Mike was suffering from this investigation, that he was suffering mentally and physically, and not doing anything to either intervene, to stop it, or to interfere in some way with his mental and physical well-being. And that, to me, a failure to prevent a grave harm when one can, is itself a wrong. And so, for me, Tuminis is absolutely culpable in Mike's death. The other thing I'd like to add to Dory's statement is that in a university community, the university community is responsible for their well-being. And that means that a suicide is not an individual act. And so in that kind of situation, when people are making false accusations, when they're making unsubstantiated accusations, when they know they are destroying someone's scholarship, someone's academic record, and someone's livelihood, future livelihood, Mike was not going to be able to be hired elsewhere. So your previous question, no, that was a violation already to his personal property.
Okay, I want to thank both of you and my sincere condolences for the passing of your dad. But I want to thank both of you for spending time here.
Thank you.
Right now, we have one of Dr. Shively's colleagues, Dr. Scott Abbott, here today. So let's bring him on. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Abbott to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell our audience a little bit about your relationship with Michael Shively, Dr. Michael Shively.
I was his colleague at Utah Valley University, and I'm the vice president of the UVU chapter of the American Association of University Professors. And when Mike was suspended, he called me and asked for my support.
You knew him for many years, and when he called you, he was an honored professor, won teaching awards. He was the chairman of his department for many, many years. This must have taken him by surprise, correct?
It did take him by surprise, but he didn't know how bad it was going to get. at that first point.
Usually, and you've investigated and done a lot of homework on what happened with this report, but usually when you have an investigation like this, what is the normal procedure if a complaint or complaints are issued against a teacher? What does the staff at the university normally do? At any university?
That's a broad question, and there are lots of possible answers. But
before they suspend somebody, right?
Of course.
Okay, so you must have been shocked too at what was happening, right?
Yeah, it was so sudden, and the only reason to suspend somebody like that would be if he was a danger to the community, and it was clear that he was not a danger to the UVU community or anybody involved.
But that accusation was made, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Because of whom?
One of his colleagues who he brought in to teach anatomy with him.
And what was her name?
Sarah Flood.
And she later said that wasn't true, correct?
Yes, she said she'd been mistaken, that she'd misunderstood a secondhand report about Mike.
Now, when he was suspended with pay, did you keep in constant contact with him?
Not constant, but about weekly, yes.
Weekly. Would he call you?
Yes.
How did you detect what was going on with him?
It developed over time. First, we were trying to figure out how to respond and best ways to respond. But over time, it started to worry me, the way he was speaking and the things he was saying. He was obviously not doing well psychologically.
Okay. And did you recommend to his family or to him that maybe he needs to go to therapy? Or?
No, his family knew lots more about that than I do. His daughter is a therapist.
Now, he eventually was called in and presented a case, right? The report. And he had to respond, I think it was in, an hour or something like that, looking through 200 pages, and he wanted to take you, did he not?
He wanted to take me much earlier in the process.
And the university refused to do that.
Right, I went in with him, and they called the general counsel, and the general counsel told him that Mike couldn't have anybody with him.
Everybody who's aware of this case really wants to ask the question, what was really going on behind the scenes? Why did this whole thing happen?
There were anonymous complaints by students. There were complaints by his colleague.
Complaints that he was too tough in his exams or what?
Yeah, students said they were experiencing psychological problems because his exams were too difficult.
But he had been there for 27 years, right?
Yes.
So there wasn't those kind of complaints for the first 26 years, were there?
Yeah, there were all along. But the problem with those kind of complaints is he is a professional. He teaches this course. He knows this course. And student complaints ought to be taken seriously depending on the context. And they ought to be taken seriously by the department chair and by his colleagues who know the field and who know the pedagogy of the field.
What is your opinion of the way this whole investigation took on?
I've written a lot about it, and I think it was a really vicious complaint. Not complaint. I think it was a really vicious attempt to fire him. And I don't know why. I don't know what's behind that. Why would they want to fire somebody with that experience and that depth of knowledge?
Unfortunately, this drove Dr. Shively to take his own life. Who do you think bears the responsibility for that?
I've argued in print that the university needs to take accountability for this. They need to admit they made a mistake. They need to settle with the Shively family. Once that's done, then they're accountable, and they can claim to be accountable. And until that's done, then we don't trust them. We're worried about ourselves. And how do we work together as colleagues at a university in that kind of climate?
Okay, I want to thank you very much for being on the program.
You're welcome.
I understand we also have Dr. Shively's son with us today, Jim Pye. We're going to bring him on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jim Pye to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve.
Oftentimes when kids grow up, they go away. But in your situation with your dad, you guys did things together, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. For many years, I think I was probably 16, 17. Mike had married my mom, and he introduced me to the sport of canoe racing, marathon canoe racing, and that continued, well, for me, it continues to this day. So it's been a lifetime pursuit of excellence in athletics and fitness, and a lot of that was instilled in me from Mike, for sure.
Were you with him when he had just returned from was it a competition, right? Prior to being let go at UVU?
Yes, I was. He was training for the competition. The big one, as we call it, the Texas Water Safari, is held second Saturday in June every year, except for this year, for obvious reasons. So he was down in March during his spring break to train with his longtime friend and partner. And when he returned, I had just returned from Rockport, Texas. I'd spent most of the previous year working a job down there. So I came back around the July 4th weekend, just before that fateful August. And I remember, Steve, we had to park kind of down below our neighbor's house because they had just resurfaced the road. So we had to kind of walk in a little trail, and he was coming down that trail with my mom to take her to a doctor's appointment. And I had a load of gear, and I was walking up, and I was taken aback. His face was sunken. There was no countenance, no spark in his eyes, almost unrecognizable. In fact, I told him, I said, "Mike, you look like crap." He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, so we'll talk when you guys get back." But it was just that the impact of seeing him after being gone for 7 months, and the stuff with UVU had begun to transpire while I was still in Texas. So I was aware of it, of course. But then I began to see from July through August just the horrific impact it was having on this guy that I'd known for 40-something years.
I've got to ask you this question. In order to successfully participate in many of these events, like the canoe ride, you've got to have a certain discipline, a certain mental focus with all athletes, whenever they, because this is endurance. Why do you think that didn't carry over, that same kind of discipline and mental fitness carry over into this crisis that he was unfortunately involved with?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer is this. There are two different things. The safari and any endurance competition requires the physical training and preparation, but it's all up here. When you're in a boat for 40, 50, 60 hours for 2 or 3 days, at some point, this is going to go. You're going to have to defeat that giant, that mental, emotional, psychological giant. And that's the biggest part of competing and being a competitive racer in the Texas Water Safari. So what happened to Mike was, not only was his physical body affected, loss of weight, loss of appetite, loss of sleep, et cetera, but he lost that battle here because of what had been done to him. So he initially was motivated. I remember when back up 2018, late fall of 2018, he was on a bike ride. That was part of his training regimen. He'd get on his bike every day and ride in the canyon. Well, this particular day, he caught some gravel and some uneven pavement, and off he went. He tore up his shoulder pretty good. They had to scope it and take some stuff out. So Mike's in a sling for about 2 months, can't do anything. And fast approaching spring break, March, when he's supposed to go to Texas and train with his old friend. The sling comes off, pulleys go up in the living room with weights attached, so he could sit and watch TV and start doing some negative resistance and some light things. And by March, he had fully rehabbed that shoulder. So the motivation, the dedication was there, and initially that was true in trying to overcome the challenges that he was now facing but it was a different challenge.
Who do you hold responsible for your dad's passing?
Mike, last year, was betrayed by his own. The administration and some faculty at Utah Valley University. They led him away, so to speak, when they escorted him off campus. And he was betrayed, not only by the administration, but by the very colleague that he had hired and taken under his wing. So whereas the mob at that scene in front of Pilate's palace cried out for Barabbas, those that betrayed my stepdad cried out for flood. We might refer to her as Judas Iscariot. He was betrayed. There was collusion. There was conspiracy. So just as the Romans and the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus of Nazareth, the defendants in this lawsuit, and perhaps others, are responsible for what happened to Mike.
And I want to thank you for being on this show.
Thank you for your time.
We have with us today Mary Slauson, who was a teaching assistant for Dr. Shively for 9 years. Let's bring her on right now. It is my great pleasure to bring on Mary Slauson. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Mary. Tell our audience a little bit about what you did with Dr. Shively. You were a teaching assistant, correct?
That is correct.
What did that job entail?
It changed over time. I started out employed by the university as his teaching assistant. I did his test questions. I typed up all of his tests, proofed all of his tests, edited manuscripts for him, many manuscripts, books, interfaced with students, taught classes for him, supplemental classes to help kids. And the beat just goes on. I mean, I answered phones, I typed up letters for him that students needed to get into different kinds of medical professions. I'm kind of drawing a blank, but I did whatever he asked me to do for a very long time.
And what was your opinion of him?
He's an amazing human being. Probably the Albert Einstein of anatomy in the United States.
You know, Steve, we've had a lot of interesting guests on this show that I think are really going to influence how this case is eventually worked out. Do you have any parting words for our audience?
Yes, Steve. What is so difficult for these people that have been on the show to understand is when a university that was a college at one stage, and to have an icon like Dr. Shively, his resume is second to none in his field. And those scholarly articles that he was so naturally just gifted in being able to prepare scholastic views and share them and be published. To think that a university would rely on a nephew of the president over the former deans that were here and the department chair, and to just bypass all of that and summarily dismiss before confronting him with, we have a concern that your tests are too hard. I asked Dr. Shively about a month before he passed and asked him if the university that they wanted you to change your tests. And I was shocked at how quickly he came back and said, all they have to do is tell me.
I want to thank both of you for being on the show, and we're going to be following this because we want to see the right thing done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.